The Arizona sun blazed mercilessly overhead as James Whitmore rode across his vast rangeland, the leather of his saddle creaking with each stride of his black stallion. Dust clouds rose from the hooves of the 50 head of cattle being driven toward the main ranch, their lowing echoing across the red rock canyon walls that bordered his property. At 32, James had built an empire that stretched from the Salt River to the Superstition Mountains, over 200,000 acres of prime grazing land that made him the wealthiest man in the territory. "Mr. Whitmore!" The urgent shout came from Miguel Santos, his foreman, who was galloping hard from the eastern pastures. The Mexican's weathered face was grim as he reined in his horse beside James. "We got trouble at Willow Creek Station." Bad trouble. James felt his jaw tighten. Willow Creek was one of his most remote outposts, a line shack that housed supplies and served as a waypoint for his cowboys working the far reaches of his land. "Apache?" "Si, Patron. Tommy Morrison rode in 20 minutes ago. Says they hit just after dawn, burned the cabin, ran off 30 head and—" Miguel's voice faltered. "They got Pete Callahan." The news hit James like a physical blow. Pete had been with him since the beginning, one of the first men to believe in his vision when he'd arrived in Arizona territory, with nothing but ambition and a small inheritance from his father's failed Kansas farm. Now, Pete was dead, another casualty in the endless cycle of violence that plagued the frontier. "How many riders?" James asked, his voice steady despite the rage building in his chest. Tommy counted maybe 8, 10 at most. "But Patron—" Miguel hesitated. There was something different about this raid. They didn't just take the cattle and run, they left signs, markings carved into the trees, like they were sending a message. James spurred his horse toward the ranch house, a sprawling adobe structure he'd built on a rise overlooking the valley. The walls were 3 feet thick, designed to withstand both the brutal desert heat and potential attacks. Gun ports had been cut into strategic locations, and a bell tower rose from the center courtyard, a fortress disguised as a home. As they rode, James's mind raced through possibilities. Apache raids had increased over the past month, but they'd always been swift strikes for supplies or horses. This felt different, more calculated. The Apache were master tacticians, and if they were sending messages, it meant someone was coordinating these attacks with precision. They reached the ranch as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and crimson. James dismounted in the main courtyard, where a dozen of his men had already gathered. Their faces were grim, hands resting on gun belts with the easy familiarity of men who'd learned to sleep with weapons close at hand. "Saddle fresh horses," James commanded. "We ride to Willow Creek at first light. I want to see these markings for myself." "Boss," called out Frank Morrison, Tommy's older brother and James's head of security. Frank was a former cavalry sergeant who'd served in the Indian Wars before settling in Arizona. His gray eyes held the hard edge of a man who'd seen too much violence. "Maybe we should wire the territorial marshal, get some federal troops involved. These Apache are getting bolder." James shook his head. "The nearest federal troops are at Fort Huachuca, 3 days' ride south. By the time they arrive, the trail will be cold. This is my land, my responsibility." As the men dispersed to prepare for the morning expedition, James climbed the wooden stairs to his private office on the 2nd floor. The room overlooked the entire valley, and from his desk he could see the lights beginning to flicker on in the small town of Esperanza that had grown up around his ranch operations. General store, blacksmith shop, saloon, church, all of it dependent on the prosperity his cattle empire provided. He poured himself 2 fingers of whiskey from a crystal decanter, a luxury shipped from San Francisco, and stood at the window. The weight of responsibility pressed down on his shoulders like a physical burden. 200 families depended on his ranch for their livelihoods. Merchants in Tucson and Phoenix relied on his cattle shipments. The entire economic structure of this part of the territory revolved around the empire he'd built from nothing. But tonight, for the first time in years, James Whitmore felt the cold touch of uncertainty. The Apache had never been mere raiders. They were fighting for survival, for their homeland, with a desperation that made them the most formidable opponents on the frontier. And now, it seemed, they had found a leader capable of turning scattered raids into something far more dangerous. As darkness settled over the valley, James finished his whiskey and checked the loads in his Colt 45. Tomorrow would bring answers, but tonight he could only prepare for whatever storm was brewing in the desert beyond his walls. In the shadow of the Dragoon Mountains, 20 miles from James Whitmore's ranch, Aiyana crouched beside a spring-fed pool, washing the war paint from her face with practiced efficiency. The black and red streaks had served their purpose during the morning raid, striking fear into the hearts of the white cowboys who had dared to fence off ancestral Apache hunting grounds. At 26, she was one of the youngest war leaders in her band, but her tactical brilliance had earned the respect of warriors twice her age. The cool mountain air carried the scent of juniper and sage as she dried her face with a strip of buckskin. Her long black hair, braided with eagle feathers and silver ornaments taken in raids, caught the late afternoon light filtering through the pine canopy. She wore traditional Apache clothing, modified for warfare, a buckskin tunic reinforced with metal studs, leather leggings that allowed for swift movement, and moccasins designed for silent tracking across any terrain. "The cattle are secure in the canyon," reported Nalnish, her lieutenant and childhood friend. He was a stocky warrior whose scarred face told the story of countless battles against the encroaching whites. 30 head, enough to feed our people for a moon. But Aiyana, we lost Dahana in the fighting. The news struck her like a physical blow, though she showed no emotion on her face. Dahana had been barely 18, eager to prove himself as a warrior. Another young life lost in the endless struggle to protect what remained of their homeland. "How did he die?" she asked, her voice steady as carved stone. "The old cowboy at the station fought harder than expected. Dahana took a bullet to the chest trying to reach the corral. He died as a warrior should, with his rifle in his hands." Aiyana nodded slowly, committing the details to memory. Every death, every battle, every small victory or defeat was part of a larger tapestry she was weaving, a campaign to drive the white settlers from Apache land through fear, tactical precision, and relentless pressure. Unlike the older war chiefs who favored massive, devastating attacks, Aiyana understood that the whites' strength lay in their numbers and resources. Her strategy was to bleed them slowly, to make every mile of occupied territory cost them more than they could bear. "The markings?" she asked. Nalnish's weathered face cracked into a rare smile. "Carved deep into 3 trees around the burned cabin, just as you instructed. The message will be clear to anyone who can read Apache signs." The markings were Aiyana's innovation, a way to communicate directly with her enemies that went beyond simple destruction. Each symbol told a story. The ranch boundaries were not recognized by the Apache. The cattle belonged to the land and not to any man, and this was only the beginning of what would come if the expansion continued. It was psychological warfare, designed to create uncertainty and fear among the settlers. She rose fluidly to her feet, every movement speaking of the deadly grace that had made her legendary among both Apache and white communities. "Gather the war council. We ride at midnight." The Apache camp was hidden in a natural fortress of red sandstone formations, invisible from any approach unless one knew the secret paths. Wickiups made from brush and hide dotted the protected valley, home to nearly 200 people, the last free band of Chiricahua Apache in this part of the territory. The men were warriors, scouts, and hunters. The women were skilled in the arts of survival that had sustained their people for countless generations. The children played games that taught them the skills they would need to survive in a world that grew more hostile with each passing season. As darkness fell, 8 of Aiyana's most trusted warriors gathered around a small fire built in the shelter of an overhanging cliff. The flames cast dancing shadows on their painted faces as she outlined her plan. "The white rancher, who calls himself owner of our hunting grounds, this Whitmore, he will come to investigate the raid," she began, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had made hardened warriors follow a woman into battle. "His pride will not allow him to hide behind his walls while we take what is ours. You want to ambush him?" asked Goyawe, an older warrior whose missing left eye was a souvenir from the cavalry wars. "Kill the head of the snake?" Aiyana shook her head. "Death would make him a martyr. Bring soldiers from the fort." "No, I want to show him that his wealth and power mean nothing in our homeland. I want him to understand that every cow, every fence, every building on our ancestral land exists only because we allow it." She traced patterns in the dirt with a stick, drawing the terrain around Willow Creek Station. "Tomorrow, he will come with men and guns, expecting to track raiders who have already vanished. Instead, he will find us waiting, not hiding, waiting. We will show ourselves, let him see that we are not thieves in the night, but warriors defending our home." The council exchanged glances. This was dangerous thinking, the kind of bold strategy that could end in triumph or disaster. But Aiyana had led them through 12 successful raids over the past 3 months, each one carefully planned and flawlessly executed. "And if he brings too many men?" Nalnish asked. "If he calls for the cavalry?" Then we fade into the mountains like smoke, and he learns that numbers mean nothing in country we have known since childhood, Aiyana replied. But if he comes as I believe he will, with enough men to feel confident but not so many as to seem afraid, then we will teach him a lesson he will never forget. As the war council dispersed to prepare weapons and horses, Aiyana remained by the dying fire. She stared into the glowing coals, seeing in them the faces of her people who had died fighting the white expansion, the children who would never know the freedom of the old days, the warriors who had chosen death over reservation life. The white rancher Whitmore represented everything that threatened her people's survival. Wealth built on stolen land, power that came from displacing those who had lived here for generations, the casual arrogance of men who believed they could own the earth itself. Tomorrow, she would look into his eyes and show him the true cost of his empire. The desert wind whispered through the canyon, carrying the scent of sage and the distant promise of rain. Somewhere beyond the mountains, James Whitmore was preparing for his expedition, never knowing that he rode toward a confrontation that would change the fate of two peoples and two hearts forever. Dawn was breaking over the charred remains of Willow Creek Station when James Whitmore and his 12-man expedition reached the site. The acrid smell of burned wood still hung in the air, and the blackened skeleton of the line shack stood like a monument of violence against the red morning sky. James dismounted slowly, his experienced eyes taking in every detail of the destruction. Frank Morrison knelt beside dark stains in the dirt, Pete Callahan's blood, already dried to rust-colored patches in the desert sand. They dragged the body about 50 yards that way, he said, pointing toward a grove of cottonwoods. Looks like they gave him a decent burial, which is strange for Apache raiders. James walked to the trees Frank had indicated, studying the carved symbols that scarred the bark. The markings were deep and deliberate, clearly visible from a distance. He'd seen Apache writing before, but these symbols seemed different, more complex, almost like a formal declaration. "Can you read any of it?" he asked Miguel, who had grown up on the border and understood some Apache dialects. The foreman shook his head grimly. "Some of it, Patron. Something about the land not belonging to any man and a warning. This is just the beginning." A chill ran down James's spine despite the growing heat of the day. This wasn't the work of desperate raiders looking for easy plunder. Someone was orchestrating these attacks with military precision, someone who understood both Apache tactics and the psychology of fear. "Boss!" called out Tommy Morrison from the creek bank, his voice tight with tension. "You need to see this." James walked to where the young cowboy stood frozen, staring across the shallow stream. On the opposite bank, 8 Apache warriors sat motionless on their horses, watching the white men with the patient intensity of predators. They made no attempt to hide or flee. They simply waited as if they had been expecting this moment. The sight sent James's men scrambling for their rifles, but he raised a hand to stop them from taking aim. Something about this confrontation felt different, more deliberate than a simple ambush. His eyes swept across the Apache riders, noting their war paint, their weapons, the way they positioned themselves to control the high ground on both sides of the creek. Then he saw her. In the center of the Apache line sat a woman unlike any he had ever encountered. Even at a distance of 30 yards, her presence commanded attention. She was younger than most of the warriors around her, but there was no mistaking who held authority. The others deferred to her with subtle gestures, waiting for her signal before making any move. Her long black hair was braided with feathers and silver, and war paint marked her face in patterns that spoke of rank and honor among her people. She raised her right hand slowly, palm forward, a gesture that could be interpreted as either greeting or warning. Then she spoke, her voice carrying clearly across the water in accented but precise English. "James Whitmore, the man who believes he owns the wind and claims dominion over the path of eagles." The fact that she knew his name sent a shock through James's system. This was no random encounter. She had been expecting him specifically. He stepped forward, keeping his hands visible and away from his weapons, acutely aware that his 12 men were outnumbered and outpositioned. "You have the advantage, ma'am," he called back, his voice steady despite the tension crackling in the air. "You know my name, but I don't know yours." A slight smile played at the corners of her mouth, not friendly, but acknowledging his courage in addressing her directly. "I am Aiyana of the Chiricahua, and these lands you claim with your fences and your cattle have been home to my people since before your grandfathers dreamed of crossing the Great Water." James felt the weight of history in her words, the accumulated grief and anger of a people watching their world disappear beneath the advance of settlements and railroads. But he also heard something else: intelligence, education, a mind that understood the complexities of the conflict better than most warriors on either side. "Those cattle feed families," he replied, his voice carrying across the creek like a negotiation between equals. "Men who work hard to build something lasting in this territory. The cabin that burned housed supplies for cowboys who have never raised a hand against your people." "Your cowboy fought bravely," Aiyana acknowledged. "He died protecting what he believed was his duty. But this land has been Apache hunting ground for more generations than your people have recorded. Every fence you build cuts across the paths our ancestors traveled. Every head of cattle you graze eats grass that once fed the deer and buffalo our children depend upon." The conversation was unlike anything James had experienced on the frontier. Most conflicts with Apache involved sudden violence or tense meetings mediated by territorial officials. This felt more like a debate between two leaders trying to understand each other's position, while standing on opposite sides of an unbridgeable divide. "What do you want?" James asked directly. Aiyana's dark eyes studied him with an intensity that made him feel as if she were reading his soul. When she spoke again, her voice carried a note of something that might have been respect. "I want you to understand the true cost of your empire, James Whitmore. Every mile of land you claim, every fence you build, every cow that grazes here represents the death of a way of life that has sustained my people for 1,000 years. You are wealthy in ways my people never sought to be, but your wealth is built on our graves." The brutal honesty of her words hit James harder than any accusation of theft or trespass. She wasn't asking for compensation or negotiating terms. She was forcing him to confront the moral weight of his success. "And if I acknowledge that cost?" he asked. "If I understand the price of what I've built, what then?" For the first time, Aiyana's expression softened slightly, revealing something beyond the warrior's mask she wore. "Then perhaps we can find a path that doesn't lead to the destruction of us both." The moment stretched between them like a bridge across the creek, fragile but real. James found himself studying her face, noting the intelligence in her eyes, the strength in her bearing, the weight of responsibility she carried for her people's survival. She was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with conventional prettiness. Hers was the beauty of courage, of someone who had accepted the burden of fighting an impossible war with dignity intact. Then Frank Morrison shifted nervously behind him, and the spell was broken. Aiyana straightened in her saddle, the warrior returning to her eyes. "Remember this day, James Whitmore," she said, her voice carrying finality. "Remember that we showed ourselves to you not as thieves in the night, but as people defending our home. The choice of what happens next belongs to you." With that, she raised her hand in a signal, and the 8 Apache riders melted away from the creek bank as if they had never been there at all. Within moments, James and his men stood alone among the ruins of Willow Creek Station, staring at empty desert that gave no sign of the extraordinary encounter they had just witnessed. But James knew he would never forget the woman who had spoken to him across the water, or the challenge she had placed before him. The empire he had built suddenly felt heavier on his shoulders, weighted with questions he had never thought to ask. 3 weeks passed after the encounter at Willow Creek, and James Whitmore found himself unable to concentrate on the daily operations of his ranch. He stood at his office window each evening, watching the desert horizon and remembering Aiyana's words about the true cost of his empire. The woman had unsettled him in ways he couldn't explain, not just her beauty or intelligence, but the way she had forced him to see his life's work through different eyes. The raids had stopped completely since their meeting, which only deepened the mystery surrounding her intentions. His men were grateful for the respite, but James found the silence more unnerving than the attacks had been. It felt like the calm before a storm, a deliberate pause that suggested larger plans in motion. On a scorching afternoon in late August, as James rode the boundaries of his eastern pastures, he noticed smoke rising from a canyon he rarely visited. The thin grey column was too controlled to be a wildfire, too isolated to be from his own operations. Against his better judgment and the protests of his 2 accompanying cowboys, he decided to investigate. The canyon was a narrow slice between towering red walls, accessible only through a hidden entrance that would be invisible to anyone who didn't know where to look. As James guided his horse through the gap, the temperature dropped noticeably in the shade of the rock walls. The sound of running water echoed from somewhere ahead, a spring, precious beyond measure in the desert. He found her sitting beside a pool of clear water that bubbled up from an underground source, surrounded by cottonwood trees that created a natural oasis. Aiyana looked up as he approached, showing no surprise at his arrival. She was alone, her weapons laid aside, wearing simple buckskin clothing rather than war paint and battle gear. The sight of her in this peaceful setting struck James with unexpected force. "You came," she said simply, as if she had been expecting him for days. James dismounted slowly, keeping his hands visible. "The smoke. I thought there might be trouble." "No trouble, only a signal." She gestured to a small fire built between carefully arranged stones. "I hoped you might be curious enough to investigate." The implications of her words sent James's pulse racing. She had deliberately drawn him here alone, away from his men and the safety of his ranch. It was either an elaborate trap or something far more dangerous, a private meeting that could destroy both their reputations and possibly their lives. "Why?" he asked, settling onto a fallen log across the pool from where she sat. Aiyana was quiet for a long moment, studying the play of sunlight on the water. When she spoke, her voice carried a vulnerability he hadn't heard before. "Because I cannot stop thinking about what you said at the creek, about acknowledging the cost of what you have built." "And I can't stop thinking about what you said," James admitted, "about finding a path that doesn't lead to mutual destruction." The honesty of the exchange seemed to surprise them both. For 3 weeks, James had told himself that his preoccupation with the Apache woman was merely tactical. Knowing one's enemy was essential to survival. But sitting here in this hidden paradise, watching the way afternoon light caught the silver ornaments in her hair, he could no longer deny the deeper truth. "Tell me about your people," he said. "Help me understand what I'm really fighting against." Aiyana's dark eyes searched his face, as if trying to determine whether his interest was genuine or merely another form of warfare. Whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy her, because she began to speak in a voice soft with memory. "My grandmother was born in these mountains when the only white men in Apache territory were a few traders who knew enough to travel with permission and show respect. She lived to see the cavalry come, to watch the miners and ranchers and railroad men claim piece after piece of our homeland, as if it were empty wilderness waiting for their use." James listened without interruption as she painted a picture of a proud, complex society that had sustained itself in harmony with the harsh desert environment for generations. She told him about Apache governance, about the careful balance between individual freedom and collective responsibility that had allowed scattered bands to survive where other peoples might have perished. "We never sought to own the land the way white men do," she continued. "We were part of it, moving with the seasons, taking only what we needed, leaving the rest for our children and grandchildren. Your fences don't just keep cattle in, they keep us out of places sacred to our ancestors." "But surely," James said carefully, "there must be some way to share this territory, some arrangement that allows both our peoples to prosper." Aiyana's expression grew sad. "Many of my people thought so once. They made treaties with your government, accepted reservation boundaries, tried to learn your ways of farming and trade. Do you know what happened to them?" James did know, and the knowledge sat heavy in his stomach. The reservation system had been a disaster of broken promises, corrupt agents, and deliberate starvation designed to force compliance. Apache, who had tried to adapt to white civilization, had often fared worse than those who continued to resist. "Not all of us are the same," he said quietly. "Some of us want to find better ways." "I know." The admission seemed to cost her something. "That is why I asked you to come here, to see if James Whitmore the man is different from James Whitmore the empire builder." The distinction hit him like a physical blow. She was right. The man who sat by this desert spring, listening to her stories and feeling his heart respond to her presence, was different from the ruthless businessman who had carved an empire from contested territory. The question was, which version of himself represented his true nature? "What do you see when you look at me?" he asked, surprised by his own vulnerability. Aiyana rose gracefully and walked around the pool to sit beside him on the fallen log. Her proximity sent James's senses reeling, the scent of sage and leather that clung to her clothing, the warmth of her body in the cooling air, the way her dark eyes seemed to see straight through his defenses. "I see a man who loves this land the way we do," she said softly. "But I also see someone who has forgotten that love in pursuit of possession. You build fences, not just to contain your cattle, but to contain your own heart. You have made yourself a prisoner of your own success." Her words were both accusation and invitation, challenge and comfort. James found himself leaning closer to her, drawn by something far more dangerous than physical attraction, the possibility of being truly understood by someone who saw both his achievements and his failures with equal clarity. "And what do you see for yourself?" he asked. "What future do you fight for?" "Survival," she replied simply. "Not just for my body or even my people, but for the idea that there are other ways to live on this earth. Your civilization offers many wonders, but it demands the death of everything that came before. I fight to prove that some things are worth preserving, even against impossible odds." The sun was setting behind the canyon walls, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. James knew he should leave, return to his ranch before his men began to worry. But the thought of ending this moment, of returning to the careful hostility that defined relations between their peoples, felt like a betrayal of something precious and fragile. "This is dangerous ground we're walking," he said, his voice rough with emotion he couldn't quite name. Aiyana turned to face him fully, her hand coming to rest on his arm with startling intimacy. "All the best things in life require courage, James Whitmore. The question is whether you have the strength to risk everything you've built for the chance of something better." Her touch burned through the fabric of his shirt, and James felt the last of his rational defenses crumble. They were enemies by every law of territory and culture. But in this hidden canyon, surrounded by the eternal desert, such distinctions seemed as fragile as morning mist. The crisis came 6 weeks later, on a cold October morning, when federal cavalry rode onto James Whitmore's ranch with orders to end the Apache threat permanently. Captain William Hayes was a career soldier with steel-gray eyes and no patience for the complexities of frontier diplomacy. He sat rigidly in his saddle as he addressed James in the main courtyard, flanked by 40 troopers armed for war. "Mr. Whitmore, we've received reports that you've had direct contact with the Apache raiders responsible for attacks throughout this territory. The territorial governor has authorized me to use whatever force necessary to bring these hostiles to justice." James felt ice form in his veins. Someone had reported his meetings with Aiyana, whether out of malice or misguided loyalty, he couldn't know. But the result was the same. The woman who had come to mean everything to him was now marked for death by the full power of the United States Army. "Captain," James said carefully, "I've had one brief encounter with Apache raiders at Willow Creek Station, nothing more than an exchange of words across a creek bed." Hayes's skeptical expression suggested he knew more than he was revealing. "Nevertheless, we have intelligence that suggests these particular Apache have established a base somewhere in the mountains east of your property. You know this terrain better than anyone. I'm requesting your cooperation in locating their stronghold." The request was really a command, and James understood the position he was in. Refusing to cooperate would mark him as a traitor in the eyes of territorial authorities. But helping the cavalry find Aiyana's people would make him a betrayer of everything that had passed between them in the hidden canyon. "I'll need time to organize my men and scout the area," James said, buying precious hours to find a solution that seemed impossible. As the cavalry made camp near the ranch buildings, James sent Miguel on a desperate mission to ride to the canyon spring and warn Aiyana that federal troops were preparing to attack. It was a betrayal of his own government, but the thought of soldiers surrounding her hidden valley filled him with a cold terror that made such distinctions irrelevant. 3 hours later, Miguel returned with news that stopped James's heart. "She's gone, Patron. The camp is empty." But there was a message carved into the cottonwood tree by the spring, Apache symbols, but also English words. "The choice is yours, Canyon of the Three Sisters. Come alone." James knew the place, a remote box canyon 20 miles northeast, accessible only through a narrow passage that could easily be defended by a handful of warriors. It was also the perfect place for an ambush, but somehow he knew that wasn't Aiyana's intention. She was offering him one final meeting, one last chance to choose between the empire he had built and something far more precious and dangerous. As the sun began to set, James saddled his fastest horse and rode toward the mountains, leaving word that he was scouting ahead for the morning's operation. The lie tasted bitter in his mouth, but the alternative, leading cavalry to the woman he loved, was unthinkable. The Canyon of the Three Sisters was named for 3 towering rock spires that stood guard over its entrance like ancient sentinels. James guided his horse through the narrow gap as the last light faded from the western sky, his heart pounding with anticipation and dread. Whatever Aiyana had planned for this meeting, it would decide both their fates. He found her waiting beside a small fire in the center of the canyon, but she was not alone. 8 of her warriors sat in the shadows beyond the firelight, their weapons ready, but not aimed in his direction. The sight sent a chill down James's spine. This was either a war council or a tribunal, and he was about to discover which. "You came," Aiyana said as he dismounted. Her voice carried no surprise, only a profound sadness that made his chest ache. "Did you think I wouldn't? I hoped you would choose love over fear, But hope and certainty are different things. She gestured to a place beside the fire. Sit with me, James Whitmore. We have much to discuss, and little time. As James settled cross-legged on a blanket beside her, he could feel the weight of Apache eyes studying his every movement. These men had accepted him into their most sacred space, based solely on their leader's word, but their trust was conditional and fragile. The cavalry will attack at dawn, he said without preamble. 40 soldiers under Captain Hayes with orders to kill or capture every Apache in these mountains. I tried to delay them, but I know. Aiyana's calm acceptance surprised him. We have been watching your ranch since the soldiers arrived. My scouts counted their numbers and observed their preparations. Then why are you still here? Why haven't you escaped into Mexico or deeper into the mountains? Aiyana stared into the flames for a long moment before answering. Because running would only delay the inevitable. There will always be more soldiers, more demands for our surrender or destruction. The choice before us now is whether we die as free people defending our homeland or accept slow death on a reservation, watching our children forget what it means to be Apache. The finality in her voice sent panic through James's system. There has to be another way, some form of negotiation, some compromise that— What compromise? She interrupted, her dark eyes blazing with emotion. Shall we agree to die slowly instead of quickly? Shall we beg for the right to exist as curiosities in a world that has already decided we have no place in its future? James felt the weight of history crushing down on his chest. Everything she said was true. The Apache had been fighting a losing battle for decades, driven from one stronghold to another as white settlement expanded across their traditional lands. The outcome had always been inevitable, only the timing remained in question. Then what is this? He asked desperately. Why did you ask me to come here if there's no hope for a future together? Aiyana reached across the space between them and took his hand in both of hers. Her touch was warm and strong, but James could feel her trembling. Because I needed you to understand the choice I am offering you, she said softly. Tomorrow, when the cavalry attacks, they will find our camp empty. My people will scatter into the deep desert, following paths your soldiers cannot track, but I will not be with them. James's blood turned to ice. What are you saying? I am saying goodbye to the woman who could love a white rancher, and accepting the burden of the war leader who must ensure her people's survival. Tears glittered in her eyes, but her voice remained steady. Love is a luxury my people cannot afford, and empire is a luxury your conscience cannot bear. We both knew this day would come. The words hit James like physical blows. He tried to speak, to argue, to find some way to change her mind, but Aiyana pressed her fingers against his lips. Listen to me, she whispered urgently. When the cavalry finds no Apache in these mountains, Captain Hayes will demand to know where we have gone. You must tell him the truth, that we have vanished into country no white man can follow, that the war in this territory is over, because there are no more Apache here to fight. And you? James asked, his voice breaking. I will go south, into Sonora, where there are still bands of free Apache living as our ancestors did. I will teach them what I have learned about fighting your people's kind of war, and perhaps together we can carve out some small space in this world for the old ways to survive. James pulled her against him then, holding her as if he could prevent her leaving through sheer force of will. She came into his arms without resistance, and for a moment they clung to each other like drowning swimmers in a sea of impossibility. Come with me, she whispered against his chest. Leave your empire and your obligations. Live free in the desert where a man's worth is measured by his courage and wisdom, rather than the size of his herd. The offer tore at James's heart with the force of a physical wound. For one wild moment, he imagined abandoning everything, ranch, responsibilities, the expectations of an entire community, to follow this extraordinary woman into the wilderness. It would mean giving up everything he had built, but it would also mean choosing love over duty, passion over security, life over mere existence. But even as the fantasy bloomed in his mind, reality crashed down around it. His ranch supported 200 families. The town of Esperanza depended on his cattle operations for its survival. If he disappeared, the economic foundation of the entire region would collapse, leaving thousands of people without livelihoods in one of the harshest environments on Earth. I can't, he whispered, the words tearing his throat raw. Too many people depend on what I've built. I can't abandon them even for you. Aiyana pulled back to look into his eyes, and James saw that she had known his answer before asking the question. I know, she said simply. It is why I love you, and why we can never be together. You are a man who honors his obligations even when they break your heart. As dawn approached, the Apache warriors began to fade into the darkness like ghosts, following trails that would scatter them across hundreds of miles of desert. Soon only Aiyana remained beside the dying fire, her face painted with the traditional markings of a war leader preparing for a final battle. "Will I ever see you again?" James asked, knowing the answer but needing to hear it spoken. "In dreams, perhaps. In the cry of eagles over the mountains. In the memory of what could have been if the world were different than it is." She rose gracefully to her feet, every inch the warrior chief who had earned the loyalty of hardened fighters. "Goodbye, James Whitmore. Remember that for a few brief weeks, an Apache woman and a white rancher found something beautiful in the midst of an ugly war." She kissed him then, a kiss that tasted of sorrow and sage smoke, of passionate love constrained by impossible circumstances. Then she was gone, vanishing into the pre-dawn darkness with the same ghostly silence that had brought her into his life. James sat alone beside the dying fire until sunrise, when the sound of approaching cavalry forced him to mount his horse and ride back to face Captain Hayes with the bitter truth that the war was over, because there was no longer anyone left to fight. 6 months later, as James stood at his office window watching spring rain fall on his vast rangeland, he received word that Aiyana had been killed in a cavalry attack near the Mexican border. She had died fighting, as she had always known she would, defending a band of Apache refugees trying to reach the safety of the Sierra Madre Mountains. The news arrived on the same day that territorial officials recognized James Whitmore as the most successful rancher in Arizona, a man whose empire had helped bring civilization and prosperity to the frontier. The irony was not lost on him that his greatest triumph and his deepest loss were forever intertwined, two sides of a coin that would never stop spinning in his heart. He never married, though many suitable women were presented to him over the years. Instead, he found ways to honor the memory of the woman who had shown him the true cost of his success, establishing schools that taught Apache children alongside white students, supporting legislation that protected sacred sites from development, and quietly funding efforts to preserve the stories and traditions of the people who had called this land home long before his grandfathers dreamed of crossing the ocean. It was not the life he had dreamed of in that hidden canyon, but it was a life that acknowledged the debt he owed to a warrior woman who had taught him that some things were worth more than all the cattle in the territory.